everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm kicking off a longer reading project that I have decided to do for the first time this year. I am going to read along with the 2026 Tournament of Books to the best of my ability. So in this video, I'll explain a little bit about what the Tournament of Books is, if you're not familiar, and why I'm interested. It's a pretty popular bookish event, I think, but it doesn't seem very widely discussed in booktube spaces particularly. And at this point, I have read 6 of the 18 books on the shortlist, so I will also share some of my early impressions of the shortlist. The Tournament of Books is basically a literary March Madness competition put on by the Morning News. It's an annual month-long event where 18 books, published in the previous calendar year, are pitted against one another in head-to-head matchups. And each weekday during the month of March, a judge reads 2 books and decides which one moves forward. And then we, the people online, get to comment and discuss. I will, by the way, of course, be leaving links to the tournament website and more information below. This is the 22nd year of the tournament, and this year it will be starting on March 6th. I have never actually tried to read along with the tournament before because obviously it's a big commitment, but the joy of it is that it turns a book prize into a book club environment, and the reviews that come out are always really well crafted and interesting, even if you haven't read the books in discussion. It's about exploring your taste and defending books you love, and it's about thoughtful critique of the books you didn't like so much. So this year, I'm trying to read the shortlist. Now, there are 18 books on the shortlist, and there is little chance that I am going to finish them all before the contest begins in March, especially because I have other reading projects that I'm trying to do simultaneously. But I will try my best, and I'm curious to see how far I get and how much my taste ends up aligning with the judges. I plan on continuing to read the shortlist even through the end of March if I don't finish in the month of March. Now, I'm going to walk through the shortlist by talking through each of the initial matchups, and as I'm going through, I will also call out which of the 6 books I've already read. Another thing I want to say is that the Tournament of Books has a focus on literary fiction, which in my definition means fiction focused on craft. Even for the genre books on the list, which there are some horror or mystery and fantasy, the prose tends to be very deliberate, and there's a skew towards kind of structurally experimental fiction. But the first matchup is going to be The Play and Round. This is 3 books that are pitted against each other to determine the one that will go in the 16th slot of the bracket. And that is why there are ultimately 18 books on the shortlist instead of 16, as you might expect for a bracket-based competition. This year's Play and Round has the theme of the Academy, and it includes If You Love It, Let It Kill You by Hannah Pittard, The Mind Reels by Frederick DeBoer, and We Love You Bunny by Mona Awad. I have read 2 of these so far, We Love You Bunny and If You Love It, Let It Kill You. We Love You Bunny is the sequel to Bunny, which I did really love. However, I probably would not have read this book if it weren't on this shortlist, because I didn't feel that Bunny warranted a sequel, if I'm being honest, and my thoughts after reading the sequel are still that it didn't really warrant a sequel. Bunny had some really sharp satire with MFA writing programs and Mean Girls and the creative process, all couched in this strange occult world where bunnies are turned into walking, talking men. And We Love You Bunny fleshes out that world and continues to be funny and sharp, but it's over 400 pages long, and I feel like at this point, we've just beaten the metaphors into the ground. I think it was just far too long for what it was, in my opinion. If You Love It, Let It Kill You was not on my radar at all. I had never even heard of this author, but apparently she previously wrote a memoir chronicling the unraveling of her marriage after discovering her husband's affair with her best friend. And this book enters the realm of autofiction because our main character, Hannah, learns that an unflattering version of herself will appear prominently in her ex-husband's debut novel, and she suffers a bit of a midlife crisis in the aftermath of this. And It's not a book that I ever would have picked up on my own, but I did enjoy it overall. It's really darkly funny, and I think that it is really surprisingly candid about topics that are really quite vulnerable and taboo, like cheating and like not wanting to have children. So I preferred If You Love It, Let It Kill You, but these were both really quite fun to read together because they both talk about the craft of writing in a darkly comic way, and I reckon the mind reels will be similar. Here's the blurb for that. In a dorm room at her safety school, surrounded by corn-fed boys and contemptuous girls, Alice is losing her mind. Her first semester is spent clinging to middling grades between drunken hookups and roommate fights. The next brings sleepless nights, extreme weight loss, and effortless, compulsive energy, paused only by an unexpected summoning from the RA for evaluation. Thus begins an endless march of lithium, antidepressants, and Klonopin, doctors and therapists when health insurance allows, along with overwhelmed parents and well-intentioned friends, all helpless bystanders as Alice descends deeper into chaos. So this is the category of women in crisis in academia, and these aren't even the only books on the shortlist about that topic, actually. We'll get to that. The winner of this play-in round will go head-to-head with The 10-Year Affair by Erin Summers, which I remember that Kat from Kat's Field Notes talked about very positively on her channel, so I'm intrigued to get to this one. Here's the blurb. When Cora meets Sam at a baby group in their small town, the chemistry between them is undeniable. Both are happily married young parents with 2 kids, and neither sees themselves as the type to engage in an affair. Yet their connection grows stronger, and as their lives continue to intertwine, the romantic tension between them becomes all-consuming, until their worlds unravel into 2 parallel timelines. In one, they pursue their feelings, in the other, they resist. I feel like the centrality of an affair in this book tees it up with If You Love It, Let It Kill You, to move up into this spot. So we have 2 books about affairs against each other, but we shall see. All right, the first matchup after the play-in round is going to be What We Can Know by Ian McEwan against The Passenger Seat by VJ Khurana. These are both going to be new authors for me, but Ian McEwan has been writing for a long time, and this is VJ Khurana's debut novel. I've heard What We Can Know described as speculative dystopian fiction. The blurb says, just over 100 years in the future, much of the Western world has been submerged by rising seas following a catastrophic nuclear accident. Those who survive are haunted by the richness of the world that has been lost. In the waterlogged south of what used to be England, scholar and researcher Thomas Metcalfe longs for the early 21st century as he chases the ghost of one poem, A Corona for Vivian. When he stumbles across a clue that may lead to the elusive poem's discovery, a story is revealed of entangled loves and a brutal crime. And the mention of crime there is interesting because The Passenger Seat is, I think, crime fiction. The blurb says, 2 teenagers leave their small town on a vaguely charted road trip through the northern wilderness with little more than canned food, secondhand camping gear, and the rifle they buy for reasons neither can articulate. The more they handle the gun and the farther they get from their parents and peers, girlfriends and online gaming, the less their actions and the games, literal and metaphorical, they play, are bound by the usual constraints. When one decides to harass a young couple they meet on the highway, the encounter leads them down a road from which there's no coming back. The next matchup is the only one where I have read both of the books, and I am devastated that they are paired up in the first round because they were both in my top 5 books of 2025 list. This is going to be The Buffalo Hunter Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones and Endling by Maria Reba. The Buffalo Hunter Hunter is a historical vampire novel told in an epistolary fashion through the diary of a Lutheran pastor living in Montana at the beginning of the 20th century, after he is visited by a Blackfeet man named Goodstaff, who is there to confess about his violent past. I have heard criticism that this book is slow-paced or hard to get into. I did not feel that way at all. I was gripped from the beginning, and I think this is a really interesting spin on what the vampire story has to offer us in this modern age about what it means for history to infringe upon our modern day of living. Endling was longlisted for the Booker Prize last year, and it is about a snail researcher who funds her work by entertaining Westerners who come to Ukraine on romance tours, believing that they'll find docile brides. She connects with a pair of activist sisters who have hatched this plot to kidnap a truck full of these bachelors as part of a feminist protest against this marriage industry. And they have just begun their kidnapping plot when the Russian invasion of Ukraine starts, and the whole book turns inside out. It is really experimental in its form, and it uses the absurd to reckon with the tragic and absurd events of the war in Ukraine and the experience of the Ukrainian diaspora. Endling very much feels like a tournament of books book to me, though I think my preference, if I had to choose, probably leans towards the Buffalo Winter Hunter. But I would not be mad whichever way this falls, and I'm excited to read the judgment for this one because I like both of these books so much. I guess my only hope is that whichever one falls here comes back in the zombie round. Quick sidebar on the zombie round, because this is a fun part of the tournament that I didn't explain before. After the semifinal round, when there are only 2 books remaining, the organizers actually create a second semifinal round by re-adding 2 books that were eliminated earlier in the bracket that were chosen by popular vote before the tournament even started. So I think it's likely that the loser here comes back in the zombie round. That's my prediction anyway. Next up is The Wilderness by Angela Flournoy and Metallic Realms by Lincoln Michelle. I have not read either of these books yet, but they were both on my radar from prize lists and best of lists last year. I'm also curious how they speak to each other because they seem quite different in style, but based on the blurbs, I reckon they're both about friend groups, so they can speak to each other thematically. The Wilderness blurb says this: Desiree, January, Monique, and Nakia are in their early 20s and at the beginning of their careers, of marriage, of motherhood, and of big city lives in New York and Los Angeles. Together, they are finding their way through the wilderness, that period of life when the reality of contemporary adulthood swoops in and stays. As these friends move from the late 2000s into the late 2020s, from young adults to grown women, they must figure out what they mean to one another amid political upheaval, economic and environmental instability, and the increasing volatility of modern life. Metallic Realms is described like this. Written by Michael Lincoln's best friend and his misfit science fiction writing group, the Orb Four, the Star Rock Chronicles follow Captain Baldwin and his crew on their adventures across the Metallic Realms. These masterpieces have gone tragically unpublished until now. But behind the greatest universe ever created, there are the all too mortal people who wrote it. As Michael chronicles the personal melodramas of the Orb Four, as well as the funhouse reflections in their fiction, the line between real and unreal becomes dangerously thin, and the true reasons for the group's fallout begin to emerge. The Wilderness sounds like a fairly traditional coming of age to me, which is not a strike against it by any means, whereas Metallic Realms sounds like yet another book on the list that fits in with the books in the play-in round that are about writing and about the line between fiction and reality. And maybe because that theme is like something I've read a lot lately, The Wilderness actually sounds like it would be more refreshing to read right now for me. But we'll see what wins in the end. The fourth matchup is between The Unveiling by Quan Berry and Too Soon by Betty Shamia. I can't say that either of these was really on my radar before the shortlist came out, but they sound intriguing. The Unveiling is about a group of survivors that become stranded on a remote island in Antarctica after a kayaking excursion for a luxury cruise goes horribly wrong. Soon, the hostile environment will show each survivor their true face, and as the polar ice thaws in the unseasonable warmth, the group's secrets, prejudices, and inner demons will also emerge, including revelations from Stryker's past that could irrevocably shatter her world. So, sounds like an interesting horror thriller inclusion on the shortlist. And Too Soon is described like this: 35-year-old Arabella, a New York theater director whose dating and career prospects are drying up, is offered an opportunity to direct a risque, cross-dressing interpretation of a Shakespeare classic that might garner international attention in the West Bank. Her mother, Naya, and her grandmother, Zoya, hatch a plot to match her with Aziz, a Palestinian-American doctor volunteering in Gaza. Arabella agrees to meet Aziz since her growing feelings for Yoav, a celebrated Israeli-American theater designer, seem destined for disaster. Too soon. Sounds like it is probably more up my alley, but as always, we shall see. The fifth matchup is between Catabasis by R.F. Kuang and The Burning Heart of the World by Nancy Krikorian. I have read Catabasis. This is a fantasy book about Alice, a PhD student in analytic magic who travels into hell with her academic rival in order to rescue her advisor, who died in a magical accident that was probably her fault. And I did like this book. It's got some pretty sharp, if heavy-handed, satire on academia, but it's really about exposing Alice's delusions and coping mechanisms throughout this quest through hell. And I thought it was quite clever and funny overall. That said, I thought it was a little long, a little bloated, and there's room in my mind for another book to beat it in a head-to-head. So, The Burning Heart of the World says it tells the story of a Beirut Armenian family before, during, and after the Lebanese Civil War. It sounds like a generational saga, but it is also relatively short, so just over 200 pages. So we'll see how it stacks up against Catabasis, which is much longer. Matchup 6 is The Director by Daniel Kelman against The Catch by Yrsa Daly Ward. I haven't read either of these yet, but The Director was on my radar because it is the only translated fiction on this shortlist, and I do think it could make the long list for the International Booker Prize, which comes out at the end of February. So I'm hoping for some crossover there. The Director is German historical fiction. Here's the blurb. To escape the horrors of Nazi Germany, G.W. Pabst fled to Hollywood. But now, under the blinding California sun, the world-famous director suddenly looks like a nobody. Not even Greta Garbo, the Hollywood actress whom he made famous, can help him. When his elderly mother falls ill, he finds himself back in Austria. Pabst, his wife, and his young son are suddenly confronted with the barbaric nature of the regime. So when Joseph Goebbels sees the potential for using the European film icon and makes big promises to Pabst and his family, Pabst must consider Goebbels' thinly veiled order. The Catch, on the other hand, sounds like it might be another book on the weirder, more experimental side of the spectrum. The reviews I've seen say it's a big, unreliable narrator kind of book. The blurb says, twins Clara and Dempsey have always struggled to relate. Their bond severed after their mother vanished into the Thames. As infants, they were adopted into different families. Clara sent to live with an upper-class couple, and Dempsey with an unaffectionate city councilor. In adulthood, they are content to be all but estranged until Clara sees a woman who looks exactly like their mother on the streets of London. The Catch. This version of Serene, aged not a day, has enjoyed a childless life. The very life, it seems, she might have had if the girls had never been born. And then the final two books in the tournament are Flesh by David Saloy and Blob by Maggie Sue. I finished Blob relatively recently. It's about a blob that our main character molds and grows into a perfect boyfriend. But this is not a book that is interested in explaining where the blob came from or how the blob works. It is interested in exploring toxic relationships and the ugly cycles we find ourselves trapped in. I hoped that this book was going to be more twisted and weird than it was. It was ultimately quite mundane for a book about a blob boyfriend, but it was fine and it was thought-provoking. I'm curious though to see how it will hold up to Flesh because Flesh won the Booker Prize last year. However, my impressions from BookTube are that Flesh was quite polarizing. I know it's quite spare in its language, and I think different people respond differently to that and about the subject matter. Here's how the Tournament of Books page describes it. Teenage Istvan lives with his mother in a quiet apartment complex in Hungary. Shy and new in town, he is a stranger to the social rituals practiced by his classmates and is soon isolated, drawn instead into a series of events that leave him forever a stranger to peers, his mother, and himself. In the years that follow, Istvan is borne along by the goodwill or self-interest of strangers, charting a rocky yet upward trajectory that lands him further from his childhood and the defining events that abruptly ended it than he could possibly have imagined. So that is the shortlist of the 2026 Tournament of Books. I'm 1/3 of the way through it, so I look forward to seeing how I feel as my own personal bracket gets more and more filled out. If you've read any of these books already, I would love to hear your thoughts, and do subscribe if you want to follow along and chat about the tournament as it unfolds. I do plan on posting more videos during and after the contest. And with that, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.